We're going to formulate a circle right here. Commonly called castle, but we don't invoke that term much. You'll hear me interchange with it because it is the official name. But the reason we don't utilize it is because we think that it's a misnomer in terms of calling these places a castle. It's better known to us as a fort and a dungeon because these places were never inhabited by any royalty, no kings, no queens, no princes, no princesses. We know they were mainly inhabited military men, mercenaries, those who came here to be able to secure the loot and the plunder that they did on Mother Africa. Starting out with legitimate trade, that you want to say legitimate, in gold, ivory, beads, and precious things, but condescended into the trade of our ancestors, human cargo. So we don't even like the term trade, trafficking. So in that respect, we always say Capecoast Dungeon Tour and dungeon. That we are here in Capecoast. It's not the oldest area. Elmina is actually the oldest. But we actually choose here if we have to make a choice because here we can actually have dungeon experience. We can actually go down to the dungeon, especially the male dungeon. Here you can actually experience the door of no return by walking through the door of no return and physically walk back through the door of return. And Elmina, because it was built in 1482, not built specifically for the trade in human cargo, so therefore they don't have actual dungeons, but they have storehouses, like you see on the side right here on this ground level. These were storehouses where they stored goods that were taken from the interior. They stored goods that we know to be the gold, the lumber, any of the other commodities they were trading in at that time. They stored them in those stores. So when the slave trade got to be in its full fruition, they just transformed those stores into dungeons, especially for the males. So that's the difference you see in Elmina. But here, almost 180 years after Elmina Fort and Dungeon was made, you see the slave trafficking was at its height. In the 1660s, the slave trafficking was at its height. And therefore, when they built it, they built it actual dungeons. And that is the feeling and the experience you get going through this experience. That's what's going to get today. Now, I'll give you a little bit of the history of Elmina as well, because even though we're not there, it's worthy of invoking their history to get the full magnitude of the experience here. It was built in 1482, and it's also famous for having noted that Christopher Columbus actually also visited there 2 times, some say even 3. He was one of the architects and also would become slave trafficking. Christopher Columbus visited the Elmina Fort and Dungeon had more to do with the curiosity and the knowledge seeking because he had heard that they were sailors and they were seamen actually understood the route going from West Africa to that tracks from America. But at that time that the earth was flat, many of us heard or were taught in the Americas. And so they heard and had the reputation that here in West Africa that there were ships that have sailed across that Atlantic. Now we all know, if you've heard of the historian and the scholar Ivan Van Sertima, when he wrote his famous book that came before Columbus, that they found many artifacts and even civilizations and art drawings of before the Columbus expedition. But Europe did not know of that. And so next year, 2024, is going to mark the 700-year anniversary of the great pilgrimage of Mansa Musa. It took 60,000-man entourage from West Africa all the way to Mecca, throughout the whole continent on a ground caravan. Now I bring that up because we're going to land with that being directly related to some of the history of Elmina and where we are right now. When he went to the east and he sat down in the palace of the Caliphate in Egypt, it is recorded that when the Caliphate asked him, how did you become the king of Mali? How did you become so rich? How did you inherit a kingdom so rich, full of gold, as you've been able to display in our kingdom and all the passages that you passed coming here to Egypt before going to Mecca? And he said that I inherited the throne from my uncle. My uncle abdicated the throne. My uncle's name was Abubakar II. And Abubakar II abdicated his throne in 1312. In 1312, he took 2,000 ships from ancient Mali to the Americas. 1,000 ships that was full of men, and another 1,000 ships that was full of cargo, including gold and other precious things, to the Americas. That was the second expedition, because years before that, he sent out 200 ships there, and only one ship returned. His curiosity increased. With the curiosity increasing, he actually himself went with a voyage of 2,000 ships to the Americas. Now, that also ended up, his trip to Mecca, also ended up spurring the curiosity. What was the source of his gold? How did this man become so rich? Now imagine, 700 years ago, the richest man in the world coming from West Africa. Imagine 700 years ago, coming from a society and a kingdom that was richer than any place that you can name today in Europe at that time. And the question begged to be answered, how is it that in 700 years, one of the richest territories in the world, West Africa, has become known as one of the most impoverished areas of the world? Because in that time, when he made that journey, and it spurred up the curiosity, and the legend reached in all parts of Asia as well as Europe, people came from all over to try to find out the source of that gold. And ultimately, it ended up landing the name here, withstanding Ghana, being the former gold gold. Because people came here, especially from all parts of Europe, to change their fortune and to find the source of that gold and to enrich themselves. And that meant exploiting this continent to the furthest extent to actually got into exploiting human beings with the so-called discovery of the world. So it is said that on Columbus's journey in 1492, that many of us were taught in the West to know the name of the ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. What you were never taught was that that expedition was led by the Nino brothers, 4 Africans, whose father came from Elmina and was taken from Elmina when he was a small boy to Spain and was renamed Nino. And Nino means small boy in Spanish. And they were given the name the Nino brothers, but they were born of Nino. And of those 4 brothers, one of the brothers, the oldest brother, Pedro, owned the Nina. And his brother, Juan, captained the Santa Maria. And nobody ever told us that. The closest they ever came to telling us that any black folks was involved in that expedition was saying they had some Moorish navigators. When they said they had Moorish navigators, Moor did not identify the ethnic group. It only said that they were black people. And the Arabs even tried to rob that heritage. So in that respect, this is how they obscured that history. These men were known for having known how to sail through the Atlantic. They were known as master navigators and map makers and ship makers. So Columbus refused to take that journey without soliciting the expertise of the Nino brothers. And that's what brought him here to Elmina. And to also find out the depth of the knowledge of those who were in this area, who knew how to sail across this ocean, who knew the natural currents of the wind, that you could take sailboats from here in certain seasons and have those winds carry you all the way to the west. And so, again, as we stand here today and we talk about the history of the trade in human cargo of our ancestors, we don't want to talk about the fact that history began in West Africa with the trading in our ancestors. That was the interruption of our history. That was the beginning of the mistelling of our history and the obscuring of our history. And so we must not mention the slave trafficking and the history of that without mentioning where we came from. You know, when we talk about Mali, it was in the string of 3 great African empires, starting with Ghana, Mali, and then Shanghai. And it was with some of the conflict that we had going on in this continent that and open up the way for Europeans to come here and to help exploit some of our internal conflicts that ultimately condescended in the worst human atrocity recorded in human history, the African Ma'afa, also currently and sometimes referred to as the African Holocaust. And today, we're going to ask that the Almighty, as we stand in this circle, the Creator of the universe, bless you to make this trip here during this season, at this time, who have made the choice to make this journey, this pilgrimage, but more importantly, were chosen. You would have to acknowledge that I'm sure there were people who had the mind to want to make this trip, who marked off their calendars to schedule this trip, who had the money to finance this trip, but for whatever reason, they're not here. But you are here, not just because you chose to be here, but because you were chosen to be here. And so we thank the Almighty for that. We thank the spirit of our ancestors for that, those ancestors that have called you back home. And we invoke both the presence of the Almighty and the presence of our ancestors to guide us in this experience here today. As we walk through this experience today, the words that you hear and being guided through, we ask that your mind, your heart, and your spirit will be open to receive it. We also ask that the spirit and the voice of our ancestors speak to you as well, and that they may receive you, and they may bless you, and may they also smile that you have made your journey back here and your feet walk on this ground. And we ask that you not only in the moments of emotion, that you feel the sadness, you feel the pain that you share, that they have suffered, that you concentrate and focus on the resilience of their spirits, that they lived and didn't die, that we could be. So in that spirit, we say Amen, Ashe, Selah.
Selah.
Our tour experience will consist of going to the condemned cell, which is over there to my right where I'm pointing. From the condemned cell, we go to the male dungeon. From the male dungeon, across the boardwalk here, anytime, they all represent at any time of this experience. You feel free to ask any question that you may be compelled to ask. Down here to the female dungeons, and then we'll walk physically through the door of no return, and then we'll come back through the door of no return. So that will be the sum total of what we will walk through and what we experience. And before we do that, let me tell you what you're not going to be able to get an opportunity to experience. But ordinarily, if things were normal, you should have also been able to experience that as well. Here on the first floor was the museum. That museum is now under reconstruction and being recurated. And ordinarily, we experience the history of this area, of this region, pre-occupation or pre-contact with the Europeans. It would begin with a film room, where a short film would give you the whole history of Africa and this region, West Africa, before coming in contact with the Europeans, what happened when it came in contact with the Europeans, what happened with the slave trafficking, and also what happened to some of us who were taken on the other side of the other world. And then you would have gone through the museum here. Like I said, both of them are now under reconstruction, so we won't be able to go through here. On top of here, you see some administrative offices down in the far wing. Here in Palava Hall, that was used for administrative purposes. In the U.S., if you buy property, you get a title, or you get a deed. Here, if you buy this property, you get an indenture. Well, here is what they made the indentures for us, for our ancestors, because we were property. And so indentures were made out to the owners for the purchase of the property that he was about to buy. There is where those companies that they were representing, those companies had their brands, and once they did finish the indentures, they would also brand their stock. Where we know the word stock market come from, Africans were the first stock of value in the U.S. and it's still the cornerstone of the stock market in Western economy today. It should be noted that all of those that came down here to do the trafficking in African human beings were licensed by royal thrones of Europe. British royal throne, Dutch royal throne, Spanish royal throne. They were the ones that gave the licensing to captains and ships to come down here with permits to be able to cut down for human cargo. niche was for them to have an understanding of who can trade in what territory. They would minimize the conflict and the competition amongst themselves. That's what that was about. So you had the English here, you had the French here, you had the Portuguese here, you had the Danes here, you had the Spanish here. And the reason why you have the Portuguese and the Spanish to lead these expeditions before the French and before the English is because the Spanish at that time in the 15th century were the most advanced scientifically of the rest of Europe because of the 700 years they had been associated with the Moors. And the Moors had brought them the most advanced science, mathematics, navigation, shipbuilding, ship sailing, any of what we would consider the latest form of technology of that day, the Moors shared with the Spanish and with the Portuguese. Not just shared it with them, the Moors ruled there for 700 years. And in ruling there for 700 years, they put up some of the most modern cities, modern societies that Europe had known. And that's why the Spanish and the Portuguese had the technology to be able to advance themselves, not only to West Africa, but to the Americas as well. So that's why you see Spanish spoken so much in the Caribbean, so much in the Americas before the English came to take over. And that's why you see also Portuguese as the largest place of Africans being held in the Americas is Brazil. And you see the Portuguese in the Congo. But you see the continuity of how they were the most advanced gods that went out is also associated with what happened in Africa. So again, once they are able to clear the room there, we're going to walk towards that room. We're going to begin this experience. Does anybody have any questions until we walk over there? I'm sure they'll only be there about 2 more minutes. It's not a long experience in there. Everybody's all right so far? Thank you. Introduction. So we can make our way to the first one. All the pictures that they show, even in the school books today, show you Africans walking naked with loincloths on from inside the interior of a jungle. They never show you any Africans with their clothes on, with their jewelry on, with their regalia on. Because if you have one piece of jewelry, they can identify where you came from, what culture, what people. All those things they have in their museums. They got our beads in their museums. They got our necklaces in their museums. They got our bracelets in their museums. They got our crowns in their museums. They got our costumes in those museums. They don't let the world see that because the world must see you naked in loincloths coming from a jungle, handcuffed and ankle cuffed, so they can fit their narrative that these were animals that we captured. And yet they know who it is that we are. That's why they refuse to return our artifacts back to Africa. They refuse to repatriate that. Remember, for those who saw the Black Panther, remember the Black Panther movie started off with a stroll to the museum before Killmonger said, wait a minute, that belongs to my people. How did you get that? That started the whole movie. But think about Europe being full with all of our artifacts. And those artifacts are evidence of our civility and who that we are as a people. So even though we're visiting these dungeons and all of that, this is not our history and our culture. This was an interruption of our history and our culture of a people who gave civilization to the world. Where we're at now is examining the scene of a crime. We're at a crime scene. And we at a crime scene as investigators to find out what happened to us as a people that interrupted us. Like any other crime scene, they carted off. You can't touch the evidence because you'll be tampering with evidence. Since we haven't got no reparations, all these places we're trying to keep preserved because it's evidence for the crime that was committed against us as a people. So we're going to enter. We're going to watch your step. There's 5 of these chambers, and each one of the doors that separate these chambers, they have iron bars on them, so you didn't have free flow between the whole floor here. So in this room, you can have up to 300 to 500 incarcerated people. Now you see our numbers. We won't spend more than 15 minutes in this place. Yes, this room here, not the whole place. Each one of them would hold anywhere from 300 to 500. Now you can imagine the cycles and the patterns. These places were not emptied out until a ship came to load up to empty them out. So if captives were being brought in here,
They were just being brought in here. They kept filling up the place. And it was the last room that we'll go into. That's the room where they were taken from through a tunnel to join the boats. And then each one of these chambers will move down. Here, you find that everything, like I said, the condemned cell was done here. Christopher, are you close enough to the light? Switch it on for a minute. These trenches here were supposed to be for what they say rainwater came in through here sometime when the wind was blowing. It's the only ventilation, the only light were these holes up here. But this also was for urinal trenches. So whatever they did in this room, they had to do it in this room. These trenches were urination. On the wall here is a little wider, that was for squatting. To do the number 2, as they say. But all in here. You see the cobblestone here, you see stones like bricks here. When you walked in, you didn't see this. But every room in here have these cobblestones. But like in the condemned cell, and the way you'll see when we walk out of here, you won't see this floor again, but this floor is excavated. And they found that there was a floor under here, because what we're walking on is the hundreds of years of the accumulation of blood, sweat, tears, flesh, vomit, puke, as we say, urine, feces, all of that is what we're walking on when you walk on the floor down here. Here we have on the wall, it may not be that visible, but we have some chalk marks. These chalk marks say where the floor was before they dug it out and got down to the floor. So that's how high the accumulation was before the excavator got back down to the floor. So when they fed us any food, it was usually in a corner. Sometimes when there was hostility, they even used these openings here just to throw food down. So you can imagine that only the strongest and the fittest in fighting over food could even be able to eat. And you can spend anywhere from 3 months down here on an average. And depending on the arrival of ships, it could be longer. And more time that was spent down here, the more crowded these places got. Now, I've been down here, but the largest group I've been down here with was about 110 people. And there was barely any room in here. So you can imagine, there wasn't no stretching out. There wasn't no relaxing, because first of all, what is under you can't stretch out and relax in. There were diseases that were developed down here that were maintained for generations. In terms of rheumatism, asthma, all kinds of respiratory conditions, because of the conditions inside of these dungeons. So you can't even imagine, again, what it is that you had committed against the people who had incarcerated you. Because unlike the myths they told us, that well, either we were prisoners of wars or your kings just sold you, when this place was built, like I said, around the 17th century, midway past the 17th century, when the English got involved as the longest occupiers of this particular dungeon, the trading in human beings, the trafficking in human beings was at its height. And being at its height, you would realize that everybody in Europe found their wealth through participating in the trafficking of Africans. So, Africa story must be told, and it must be told by Africans, because they've lied to us too long. And the problem has been in the past that we have not known enough of the truth. So I tell people all the time that we, especially in the diaspora, but Africans in general, we are those who refuse to die. Some of our ancestors chose to die. Some chose dignified suicide. Some chose to confront the enemy knowing they would be killed rather than live in this condition. But some chose life so that there could be a tomorrow, even though there was no guarantee what that tomorrow would be. So somehow we know that we are a product of those who chose to live and not die. So we have an obligation to make sure that that sacrifice is not in vain by not surrendering to mediocrity or failure. If we got any young people in here, or any young people in our lives to tell a story to, we don't have mediocrity as an option. We don't have failure as an option because people suffered their whole life so that the generation coming after them can be freer than they were. And that's what we want to remember in here. It's sad to be in here. Many people cry in here because it invokes that emotion. But what we should take away from here most is the resilience of our people to have survived all of that. And look at us now today. Although we have so many challenges that we have as a people, but even to have survived is a victory for our people. So what we're going to do here, we're going to take our right hand, we're going to touch a part of the wall, and we're going to remember some of the men and the males in our lives that have made a difference. We're going to remember them, we're going to pay honor to them, we're going to pay tribute to them. That's going to be our moment of silence. By touching the wall with our right hand and sharing this moment with those who are not able to share this moment. And say thank you to all of those who sacrificed so that we can be. Go back to the walk straight ahead.
Please watch your step.
Going out, watch the step on the floor. And now you see the floor transform again, but at least you know what you're walking on. Now you don't see, you see these natural trenches, but you don't see the actual trenches. But again, as I say, you know what you're walking on. Each one of these, as I said again, iron bars on them to separate one corridor from another. Now imagine even 50 people in here for 3 months, let alone 300. Same ventilation, 2 holes. They have crossbars of iron in there that have deteriorated and rotted and rusted away. That was to deter any idea that you can climb up there, climb through, or escape. But there's no escape. So there is a long wall down there. The only thing you can do is fall and bust in your skull. Here, you will see an opening. Because of the acoustics, they would have a multilingual African here who would understand languages of the area. Their job was to interpret anything that we were discussing down here and report it. You couldn't see who the person was, but they could hear everything being spoken down here and make a report of it. So you see the whole idea that when there's no enemy within, the enemy without can do you no harm. We're always getting someone of our own or from our midst or somebody familiar with us to turn on us, to make the job of oppressing us easier. And that's what that represents up there. So we continue to walk through it. Watch again because these trenches out here. Watch your step. Just take your time. Here you can see the crossbars. These are the only ones left. All of them have these crossbars. This was the last corridor. I'll wait till everyone gets in. this was the last corridor, including the section over here. And what would take place, those in here would be the first that would go out. Behind, this is the wall here. This wall wasn't always here. This is the opening that led to a tunnel. And this tunnel led you all the way to the other side where the female dungeons are, and where the door of no return is. When the British abolished the trade in our ancestors in 1807, in order to try to stop mainly the new American nation from coming here getting more Africans to supply their economy, they put an embargo on trading across the Atlantic of anybody coming here to get new Africans and bring them into the so-called New World. So part of that effort, they blocked this and tried to shut down the business in these dungeons. And that was in 1807. So the British abolished, quote unquote, the slave trade in 1807. But they didn't abolish slavery in 1834. And the reason for that is because they lost the war in the Americas. And because they lost the war in the Americas, it wasn't about philanthropy, it was about stopping the new American nation from prospering on getting Africans from Africa to build up their economy. So they put an embargo on the sea so you couldn't come here and get any new Africans. The proof of it is that, remember, the British came back to America and burnt down the White House in 1812. So that they still had an attitude, they still didn't want the new American nation to prosper. And to cut them off from Africa was a main economic blow. But the plantation growers, the plantation owners in the Americas, they developed a more cynical strategy. That cynical strategy was they started breeding us as if we were animals there. So they got some of the strongest African men and made them studs, and they made the women breeders. So you have black women breeding children every year like they were cattle until you couldn't breed no more. That's because they couldn't come back to Africa and get a new stock. So they start creating their own stock. So in that respect, we recognize that this shrine is here, this holy place. The priest is here because before the British came, before the Swedes came, before the Europeans came, you know, when they come to conquer you, they want to find out what is holy and what is sacred to you. And they found out that this was a sacred place. This whole place is built upon a rock. And this rock and this stone in this area, it was considered sacred, and major deities were here. Here, the deity is called Nana Tabir. And so when they came here, as we know, by African spirituality and our spiritual truth systems, that we believe that there are sacred places in the earth. Now, both the scriptures talk about that, but because we got the scriptures interpreted to us through European lenses, it hides the African reality. That's right there. But we know that before there was any such thing as in the Bible, a temple or a church or a synagogue or anything like that, we considered places that were sacred. So when the original Israelites were brought up out of Egypt, they went to the mountain of Sinai, Mount Horeb. Jacob left his mother and father and said he went to a place, he lighted upon a place, he saw angels ascending and descending, and he woke up, he was frightened and called the place Bethel. He put stones there, and he poured libation on the stones, and said, this is the house of God. Right now, a big conflict is going on in Jerusalem. Muslims possess the Dome of the Rock, Al-Aqsa. That Dome of the Rock is the place they said they built Solomon's temple, the Dome of the Rock, because there's a rock there, and that rock there is considered sacred. And they built the mosque around the rock. That rock is where Solomon slaughtered all his animals, making sacrifice and pouring libations for a holy place. In Mecca, inside the Kaaba, there's a stone. And that stone is what makes the place sacred. They said that Ishmael and Abraham placed that stone there. I'm saying that because some people come down and misinterpret what they say. Oh, there's a stone there, Africans still worshiping rocks and stones, and I don't know what they're doing. But the whole world knows what we're doing because they follow us and copy us. And they relabel and repackage it. So this is not a stone, but this stone comes from the real rock that this place is built on. And when the British took over this place and built this place, the priests came and removed the deity in town. And when 1957 independence came to reclaim this place, they brought the deity back here. And that's why the priest stays here to keep this place. He's going to pour libations to welcome all of us and to say, well, libation is a prayer. Well, sometimes we separate the two, but libations is the African prayer, and that's what he's performing right now.
Ago.
Amen.
Ago.
Amen.
Ago.
Amen.
Awazi akupamapa, awuna boso no kewazi. Esi meri baso shema pele nyomi. Ewazi kama pele kama pele ngere aka. Nko to shema ina. Ta benso. Igba to so mi se pan mai. Ewa ko ko ifo ko nseyo. Se kana wana na me yo. Wana na no ahanu udie wa yo kure. Woko wasan we chuamba. Wasan we chuamba wa wo wasan ba. Wa go okrum. Wa be ni wa wetu. Papa wo bo wo ba. We be dia wo dia ya ta maye mo wan. We be dia wo se maye shamo wan. Mo fa mo nkwado. Wo kunu mo nkwado. Wo yi mo nkwado. Ampa wo be de fi be. Boko so de fi boko. E ko na ta be. Mo kwa so di. Papa wo ba. Ya sha ko fa se ma fi shepa. Ayo pe yi just say we sha be so. No kwado. Wo so na la shaman. Yes, Papa.
This was the prayer from first. He asked the Most High for the blessings upon the rain before praying. He said, our ancestors, when they were living here, they thought they would never return. But our gods have brought you back. And then once you are here, he prays for you, your children, your wives, and your family. He knows you came by machine, which is the aeroplane. So he's also asking the God to send you back safely as you go back. And he also wished you a new year, because we are in the month of December. So he's also using this opportunity to wish you a new year as you are here.
That's a big So in that respect, anybody want to show any appreciation, anything, they're free to do so, free of heart, only free will, no obligation. Again, as I said, we are currently in an exercise to try to have this wall removed, so in the future we can actually go through the full experience of walking through that tunnel and knowing what the distance is, what the experience is. We'll see a part of that. We will see a part of that when we go out there. I'll show you the corridor itself of what this tunnel represents as we go through. This the clay is a symbolism of the earth, and that the earth has received you well, so you know exactly what that is. Sometimes, especially those of us in the diaspora, when we have that marking as a ritual that we use. All these reefs in the corner there are solidarity reefs that people, delegations come and lay. We do it during contest. Every July 31st, we have a reverential night in this whole place, because it precedes Emancipation Day on August 1st, which we celebrate every year. And we lay wreaths. We light 7 candles. That's what these color boxes up there are. We do that during contest. We just bring them down here, and we light 7 candles. Those candles are lit in commemoration to all of our ancestors who died resisting being captured in the villages. All those who died on the trek coming down from where they were captured to the East Coast. All those who died in the dungeons, those who died in the middle classes, those who died on the plantation, those who died in the rebellions and the resistance, and those who continue to get slaughtered today, still seeking liberation for our people. That's what those 7 candles represent. The reason why the wreaths are there and not thrown away is because they were dedicated. We said this is sacred ground, so we can't throw them away. So we just line them up there until such time as we can figure out a dignified way to dispose of them, but we cannot throw them in a garbage, anything like that. So that's why you see all those wreaths lined up in the corner over there. So we're going to go back upstairs and continue the experience.
Those who are done, you can.
getting out to work and try and ask them to deal with coming to this point. A lot of them died because on their way in here, while the animals and have some of them, some go there in business, others also private contract.
Wow.
Yeah.
In 2009, President Barack Obama and President Obama came in 2009. That's what the black representatives. Because it was such a short notice, they also didn't know what to do to commemorate their arrival here. So they ended up doing the same thing they did over here. They let President Barack Obama and Michelle put this plaque on the wall here. And the tour guide who did the guide were very close friends. And he expressed that during the whole narrative, Michelle, the children, the mother, there are a number of times they expressed some emotion during this whole experience. The president was pretty well composed. But they said when he came out of these dungeons, you could see that he was moved. But nothing moved him more than when he came out of the dungeon. They told him that this was the church. So the church was right above the male dungeon. Can you imagine? That with all the suffering, even the stench alone coming out of there, you'd have thought that it would have, moved him some kind of way. But this was the church, Anglican church, that was right above the male dungeon. And we'll move over here to complete that narrative. It's the only African gravesite that's identified in this courtyard. These are Europeans. This whole area here is like a graveyard because many of the European soldiers were buried here. Some of these spots you see with cement that doesn't have the brown stone on it is where excavations took place to dig up some of the remains. But the Smithsonian and them came through here. They wanted to do DNA testing and everything. But what we know is that when our ancestors died, they simply threw them overboard to the sharks in the ocean. No dignified death, as I said in the condemned cell. But he was here and dignified because the Europeans had very little success convincing our ancestors to convert to Christianity in the beginning. Part of it was the language barrier, but it wasn't so much of a language barrier because they understood very well the character of the Europeans. And they didn't believe that the Europeans had the capacity in their character to tell them about God. So they had a very low conversion rate. So what they did was came up with a scheme. They ended up taking some of our people, and this is the first one. They took them to Europe, educated them to be a minister in the Anglican Church, so that he can come back and proselytize and minister to converting his own people. It's called Philip Quaku. And even though he went there with a number of other African students, he was the only one to survive the weather and everything else and came back here. And so he opened up a church here, and he opened up the first school here. And that was to try to proselytize and sell Christianity to the local population here. Because you can imagine that when the Europeans came here, it was a daily exercise to rape our women. It was a daily exercise to see them beating us and whipping us. And so when you don't understand a person's language, the only thing you have to go through is their actions, literally. You have to judge their acts. So in their acts, they saw their character. So that did not merit them being able to tell the people who are obsessed with spirituality and know God already that you should follow my God. And so this was the beginning of setting up the first church in this area. And you see between Capecoast and Elmina, you have the oldest legacy with some of the major denominations in Christianity. And still that legacy is here in Capecoast and Elmina. But you see right on the edge of this coast, not far from here, they have the Philip Quaku Elementary School. Like I said, the first school started right here in this edifice itself, and it's by him. This is the reason, even the separation, even in death. But it's the only African that you see with a marked grave in here, and it's Philip Quaku. These gravestones are new. They're only about 3 years old, but they built a new harbor here. So they built this new harbor, so these gravestones are imported stones. So over here, where the brown stone is, that's the big rock that I was telling you this whole edifice is built on. There's a whole big stone rock this whole place is built upon. These gravestones have just been laid on top of it. But the brown stone here is actually a big rock that was
considered a sacred space and place here. And so you get an idea of the concept of what I was explaining downstairs about how this old edifice was built at a sacred place because they wanted to be able to take over what we held sacred and say they rule that, they dominate that. And that would bring about the spiritual submission of the people. You see these short cannons fight off ships from short distance. The longer ones down this side, it fires out further to get ships, who are further out. You have to remember that I can't say it enough. I can't repeat it too much. That Europeans got enriched by the plundering of Africa. So these cannons were the competition amongst Europeans to fight for a space of Africa. One European nation seen another European nation get rich because of their plundering of Africa, their trips to Africa. Like you see African youth today risking their lives across the Mediterranean, trying to get to Europe, doing anything they can do to get to America. Not because they don't like the African sunshine. Look at this sun. Not because they don't like the soil, but because they need money to survive. Well, 500 years ago, Europeans risked their life to come to Africa because one voyage to Africa can change their whole life around in terms of the bounty and the riches that they got from taking a voyage to Africa. Any European that owned a corner of Africa, that was the source of their wealth and their riches. So they fought for those corners. They fought each other for that. Not for the abolition of slavery, but for the possession of Africa. Can you imagine after World War I, the punishment of Germany for starting World War I was losing her African territory. That was the punishment that the other Europeans said to Germany, for you, for starting this World War I, you're going to lose your piece of Africa. So they lost Namibia. Germany used to own Namibia. Germany used to own Togo. So that was the punishment because the source of wealth in Europe was Africa. It used to be Africans, and then it turned into Africa. So we were that source. So everybody needed a piece of Africa to get wealth and to change and transform their being. Europe was a poor peasant continent, and Africa transformed it to what it is today. And it's still maintaining it today. These cannons are real cannons. These cannonballs are real cannonballs. They've been preserving them since the time of the takeover when they were left here. These are all wells because they have the storage of water in them. Thousands of gallons of water. And the times that things got rough, they couldn't go outside of these forts. It was a refuge. They had to stay inside here. They needed pure drinking water to survive. Because it's a historical monument, even when things fall apart, it's still evidence of what was here, so we don't remove what's historical still. But this is just what time that. These are full cast iron. And in time it just fell apart. But these are short cannons. These short cannons are put down mainly local uprisings. And they usually stand at the gates outside there. As I was explaining downstairs about them sealing the walkway, the tunnel, this is the tunnel. So when there was movement and they were emptying out the dungeons, the male dungeons, they have the males come through here, but they have sentinels up here to make sure they kept moving. There was no stalling. And this is where they had two of these sentinels on. One is here and one is over here. So they would just simply have sentinels here, making sure they kept with the movement, So this is the tunnel that we spoke of in the male dungeon there. So you can look down and get a sense of it. And we got another one over here with the gate closed, but the same tunnel. So you can monitor the movement. There's another one that's central to monitor the movement here. You see the tunnel continue coming down this way. this is the exit of the tunnel. This is where they exited out. So all the men that were brought all the way from that side were brought underground through the tunnel, and they exited through here. This was actually another gateway to the ships before they closed it, before they used both. They could use that door of no return, which we're about to go to, or here. But this was the actual exit. So they sealed both ends. They sealed that end, and they sealed this end. So you only saw through the sentinel gates that you saw the tunnel when they're walking through, but they sealed both these sides here. Now, you know, Europeans had so many superstitions, traveling these waters and everything, and one of the superstitions was that they didn't like traveling with women on the boats, and they didn't give women the opportunity as men. Because these were economic expeditions and exploitations, the women didn't have the same opportunity as the men. I say that to say that our women became the prey. It's our women who were at their mercy, and they had no rights. They only had their way. It was only by rank in terms of those who had the first choice. But for those women that proved to be too difficult, would not submit, would not, give in, they were isolated and put in here for punishment until they can break their spirit, if they could. If they couldn't, and they proved too difficult, they end up in that themselves. They'll be started off with. They were fed through here. And as I said, usually whoever was designated as the governor, whatever the rank of the officers, they're the ones that got the first choice of any of our women. If our women got impregnated for whatever reason, and they found interest in them, or any mercy, it could be the means of their release. But that release meant that they ended up having to blend into the local population, but most people, they weren't from here. They were brought from other places. Sometime in the development of it, and through time, it ended up being that the offspring of those children were the first that had access to education. And at one point or another became the middle people in exchange of business. Fathers being white, mothers being African. And then the children, having been educated in the white man's language and in his ways, they end up being some of the first, as I said, middlemen in business. You find this area was the first to have schools. Not only just for, quote-unquote, Ghana or the Gold Coast, but for West Africa. So some of the oldest schools in West Africa are in this town and city in Capecoast. And so the oldest churches in West Africa are in this area here. The oldest Bible is in this area here. And so you see the whole city develop outside of these forts. The courthouses outside of these courts, the churches outside of these courts, the banks outside of these courts, all of them were close. So the modern city was built from these forts and expanded out because it was in proximity that if anything happened locally with a disturbance, they had to be able to take refuge in the fort. And so you see the whole township, everything developed from these centers. Again, we take a closer look at these doors here. These are storerooms. Up near the front, they removed the doors. Interestingly enough, they removed the doors because what they have in the door, they have a symbol that some people find an interest in wanting to hide. It's a symbol of the six-pointed star that had belonged to some of the European Jews who were involved in the slave trade, who liked to hide their identity because at that time there was no state of Israel that they claimed. And so they were throughout the populations of Europe. So when you say the Dutch were involved in the slave trade, the Spanish were involved in the slave trade, the English were involved in the slave trade, and go on and name the people, you will never hear the European Jews' name mentioned because they were in those societies. So it is the nations that you hear, but you don't hear that they were extractors, they were the bankers, they were insurance brokers, because every ship that left here was insured. And so they were part of the merchants that were involved and they had their hand in it as well. And these are the things they like to hide and don't like to say. So if you look at the doors of this, I took you there, you look at them, you see it, but it's a mark of their presence and involvement at that time in the enslavement of our ancestors as well. So again, we continue on towards the female dungeon. Now, the female dungeons on both sides. Both sides are female dungeons. You'll see that these are all iron bars here. You see the holes in them. So although they have better ventilation than the male dungeons, it had nothing to do, again, with the humanity or the consideration for our women. It's just that they had easier access to them and choosing them for their own pleasures with this kind of incarceration. It had nothing to do with making their incarceration more comfortable for their sake, but more convenient for their captives' sake. So on both sides here, you have populations of up to 150 each. We're going to go inside one of them, this one. But we're going to have to pay the same tribute to our mothers and all. This one, there's no light, so you got the original effect. Yes. This is where they kept our mothers, our aunties, our wives, our daughters. This is where they kept all the female population. These rooms could hold a minimum of 150, maximum usually of 300, each one of them. The suggested occupation was 150. But again, as I said, when greed and money is your purpose, those rules were often flaunted. So everything was done here. No provisions was done for their particular peculiar needs as women. They were treated with no dignity, no respect whatsoever as human beings. It's so interesting to hear today how people talk about human rights so loosely, and we do know that's an important issue, but when it comes to African people, people do not still think that we deserve those same accommodations or advocacy for the basic human rights amongst the families of the earth. I've been at this exercise a long time, and up to almost 30 years now. And some of us have been involved with trying to preserve the integrity of these edifices. 29 years ago, 7 of us, when that place I showed you that used to be a church, it used to be turned into a bar and a restaurant 30 years ago. So you can come out of that male dungeon and see people upstairs drinking and laughing and all of that. And some of us protested that and said that this place should be treated like a sacred ground with no laughing and no frivolous business going on. So we fasted for 3 days and 3 nights, no food, no water, and slept in this dungeon where we're at one night, and in the male dungeon where we started off over there 2 nights. And so it drew the attention of the press and everybody that this is sacred ground. And you couldn't do that in Auschwitz, you couldn't do that in Oslo or nowhere. So how can you come here where our Ma'afa took place, our Holocaust took place? So this should be sacred ground. So that's why we hollow it. If we don't hollow it and call it sacred ground, who will? So in that respect, we pay tribute to all of our mothers, our daughters, our aunties, our sisters, all of our female friends with a moment of silence, but we want to touch the wall again here, but this time with the names of all of our women, honoring the dignity and the respect that they deserve by calling out their names and by remembering them and thanking them for still having the courage to give birth to a nation of people, to give birth to a race of people, to keep our pedigree going and not to give up and not to surrender. Under the most horrendous conditions, they still took our seeds and nurtured them and kept a people alive. some of us who've gone through tragedy, some of us who've heard family members, friends, and acquaintances go through tragedies where they may have lost a loved one, where they may have lost somebody close to them, and they weren't there, and it was a tragedy at the loss. There's that sense of wanting to see where it happened. That sense of visiting the place where they may have made their transition. As I said earlier, visiting the scene of the crime. That's what we have been engaged in. That's what we are being touched in the spirit by today. Coming to see where it happened. Coming to see where we got dislodged from our motherland. Coming to see one of the last places that we experienced. And we coming to the door of no return. It wasn't of this size at that time. This door was significantly smaller, probably just about to this corner, because they only wanted to make it there one person at a time, so you couldn't rush through this door. Now, when we were going here and this trade began, we weren't going to America because there was no America. We wasn't going to the Caribbean as we know it today, but there was none. What we do know is that they called it at that time a new world, and we were going to build it. We were going to build new worlds that the whole world is being sustained through today. It's because of our ancestors being taken away from here, who were used to being part of kingdoms and kingdom builders. As I said, the narrative has been so distorted that they make them think that those who were prisoners of war, those who were useless in villages, were just sold off by their kings. But they never tell us how they narrowed down to the expertise that they were looking for coming to Africa to build a new world. They knew where the grain growers were. Who were the rice growers? It's not by accident that the Carolinas had Carolina rice and Uncle Ben's rice. They came to Africa and got rice growers. There was no vocational schools there that they took us to when you got a boat and sent you to vocational school to learn you how to be a farmer, to learn you how to be a blacksmith, to learn you how to be a cattle raiser and a husbandman. These are the skills they took from Africa to go build a whole new world. So millions of people from the ages of 12 to 30 years old were taken from here as a workforce to build literally new worlds that the whole world is coming to enjoy today. That didn't exist when we left here, but became manifest by the sacrifices that we made. And when our ancestors left here, some of them didn't have the perception that it would be the last time, but some instincts told them that if they'd gone on these waters and leaving these shores, they didn't know when they'd see it again. So some, even if they could take a piece of soil with them, some if they could even talk into the ethers to pray that they can return and get back here. And never had those hopes and aspirations fulfilled. But the fact that we are here, and they are us and we are them, those aspirations have been fulfilled. Because we made it back, and we remembered. And don't think that we just woke up and had an idea, or walking down the street and had an idea. Their DNA still speaks to us today. They're speaking to us. Remember me. Don't forget me. And your return back and journey here is a way of remembering them. And in remembering them, we keep them alive. Our generations are just learning now again how to pour libation and call their names. How many years we've been separated from these exercises that were traditions that were born from years and years of tradition and culture. So we're going to walk through this door. We're going to walk through this door thanking them for the resilience of hanging on, sacrificing, that a new generation can come up, and we're here, and we won't disappoint them. And then we're going to we're going to do something they weren't able to do. We came in here and flew on the wings of the air, in the wings of the sky. But now we're going to walk back through the door when we return, walk back through with our feet on this soil and say, I have returned. And that's a blessing. So we're going to go through to the other side, and then we're going to walk back through. So we thank the Most High for having blessed us, and our ancestors having been with us, and for them having called us home, and for us having an ear to hear their call. So, as I said upstairs there, these gray rocks are all new. They were not there 3 years ago. These were these rocks down here 3 years ago. The sea actually come up to the bottom of these steps. So literally when I asked them to take them out this door, none of these steps were here either. They just came, they got into these canoes, and the canoes took them to the big ship throughout in the ocean. The big ship canoes have to come up this slope. So these steps were built in 1998, unlike these rocks that just came here about 3 years ago. These stairs were built in 1998 when Ghana celebrated the first Emancipation Day ever on African soil, on August 1st, 1998. We brought the remains of two ancestors back from here. One named Carson from the African burial ground in New York, and the other named Crystal from Jamaica. And they brought them in to reinter them back here in Ghana. They say the ancestor remains have returned. I was a part of that ceremony. So I rode with them on the boats from Anamabu area, Abanzi, so that we had all these boats lined up from Capecoast and Elmina in 2 rows. And we put the remains, we had a service for them at the Du Bois Center in the Marcus Garvey Guest House that lasted till midnight the night before the 31st of July. And then we brought them down by limousine. We stopped about 30-minute car ride from here and put them on these big canoes, and we brought them back, like we were bringing them back home on the boats, like they left on the boats. So I had the privilege of being able to view everybody on this beach, and thousands of people were here, all in red and black funeral colors. So I had the pleasure of seeing them coming in from the sea. And then they had the elders, they poured libations. We made these steps so they could carry the coffins up without stumbling or anything. And at that time, we labeled this the door of return. We bring them back home. And we had a funeral service in the courtyard before taking them to Asim Manso, where they called the last bath, and we reinterred them. In 2019, the Prime Minister of Barbados brought another ancestral remain there. So now we have 3 grave sites there. We have the remains from Barbados, one from Jamaica, and one from the U.S. And that's at the place we call the last bath. Our ancestors were brought down from the interior to take a bath at the river there, and then they bring them down here to incarcerate them into these dungeons. And so from that period on, we welcome our brothers and sisters back through the door of return.
Yeah.
And we're going to go back through the door of return. And when we do that, this time we're going to use the same right hand and say, I have returned. And that will bring us to the close of this chapter and portion of our experience. But I think that you should be given the invitation and the opportunity to take a group picture under the sign of the door of return, so that you can have a picture of the experience itself.
Please come this way. So say, I think it's
You want to get in one?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
So our right hand, I have returned.
Right.
I have returned. I have returned. And you're saying it to your ancestors that left you, as if it is, you've heard their cry and you've returned. So you feel that you walk through and touch that door. I have returned. So before we go back into the blistering sun, as I stated, this sign is Akwaba, and it is meant to say welcome back home. It's in a very obscure place, but it's meant to say welcome for those who are coming back through the door of return. And so I pray that this experience has been just that, an experience, a meaningful one, and that it has touched you. As I said, there are plenty things that have been said, but more things that have not been said. And I'm sure that it will resonate because you've been a part of it. And it will speak to you. It will continue to unfold some of the secrets and some of the things that were unspoken as you return back to your regular program today, as you return to your hotels, even when you're on the airplane and you're returning back and when you go back. Some things will only come to you when people ask you questions. How was it? And you begin to reflect, and things will come to you. But it's my pleasure to have been able to share this sacred moment with you because it is sacred. And once again, pray that you may continue to be blessed in your stay here, and your trip here, that the Creator may embrace you, that the ancestors may embrace you, and that most of all, we thank the Creator for having given you an ear to hear and have made this journey and chosen you. That's it. Now that you know you've been chosen, now you have to also understand what that chosenness was for. Yes. So, Dasi, thank you very much. Thank you. Yes. Usually we try to do this early enough, so if the day is hot now, it's just beginning to start. So between now and 3 o'clock, it'll be almost impossible.
So you've been here for,
I've been here for 30 years.
so, you're not sweating as much as we are. I guess something changes after
Well,
a
it
while.
did. It did. A whole lot changed.
Diet.
Yeah.
Yes.
We know,
Big part.
yeah, we just noticed that the names,
Yes. Absolutely. No, it took some time. And because again, we can't negate the fact that we are on the equator right now. We are 0 degree longitude, not 0 degree latitude. We're living in the center of the earth. And so that is no joke in terms of, the adjustment in our metabolism, especially those coming from North America, in the northern region. So it took me a couple of years, if I had to guess, almost about 3 years, the whole system acclimate and change over. On surface, there's only 2 that are here. One because my wife was that way from the Volta region, and we're in the Fonte region here, even though here they speak Fonte and Tree. So that is what my ears are accustomed to hear that. But nobody here speaks one language. Nobody. Nobody.